Good morning, welcome back. Ooh, we're at the good part of Burning Bridge, where they're trying to get that other fire to start, and Will was shooting arrows at the Vorgals, and the Vorgals went back. Now the Scandians are there. So, but we're not going there right now. We're going back to the the castle kingdom. Galan slept like a log for 6 hours, totally exhausted, in the tent where Halt had taken him. Throughout that time, he didn't stir once. His mind and body were shut down, drawing new strength from total rest. Then, after those 6 hours, his subconscious mind stirred and began to function, and he began to dream. He dreamt of Will and Horace and the girl Evelyn. But the dream was wild and confused, and he saw them as captives of the Vorgals, tied together while the two robbers, Bart and Carney, stood by and laughed. Galan rolled onto one side, muttering in his sleep. Halt, sitting nearby repairing the fletching on his arrows, glanced up. He saw that the young ranger was still asleep and went back to his routine task. Galan muttered again, then fell silent. In his dream, he saw the servant Evelyn as the king had described her, with her hair long and uncropped, masses of it flowing down her back, thick and lustrous and red. And then he sat up wide awake. "My God," he said to a startled Halt, "it's not her." Halt swore as he spilled the thick, viscous glue that he was using to attach the goose feather veins to the arrow shaft. Galan's sudden movement had caught him by surprise. Now he mopped up the sticky liquid and turned with some irritation to his friend. "Could you give a bit of warning when you're going to start shouting like that?" he said peevishly. But Galan was already out of the camp bed and hauling on his breeches and shirt. "I've got to see the king," he said urgently. Halt stood warily, not altogether sure that Galan wasn't sleepwalking. The young ranger shoved past him, dashing out into the night and tucking his shirt into his trousers as he went. Reluctantly, Halt followed him. There was a slight delay as they reached the king's pavilion. The guard had changed several hours before, and the new sentries didn't know Galan by sight. Halt smoothed things over, but not before Galan had convinced him that it was vital for him to see King Duncan, even if it meant waking him up from a well-deserved sleep. As it turned out, in spite of the late hour, the king wasn't sleeping. He and his supreme army commander were discussing possible reasons for the raids into Celtica when Galan, barefoot, rumpled-haired, and with several buttons still askew on his shirt front, was allowed into the pavilion. Sir David looked up in alarm at the sight his son presented. "Galan, what on earth are you doing here?" he demanded, but Galan held up a hand to stop him. "Just a moment, father," he said. Then he continued, facing the king. "Sir, when you described the maid Evelyn earlier, did you say red hair?" Sir David looked to Halt for an explanation. The older ranger shrugged, and Sir David turned back to his son, anger clearly showing on his face. "What difference does that make?" he began. But again Galan cut him off, still addressing the king. "The girl who called herself Evelyn was blonde, sir," he said simply. This time it was King Duncan who held out a hand in silence to silence his angry battlemaster. "Blonde?" he asked. "Blonde, sir. She had cut it short, as I said, but it was blonde, like your own, and she had green eyes." Galan told him, watching Duncan carefully and sensing the importance of what he was telling him. The king hesitated a moment, covering his face with one hand. Then he spoke, the hope growing in his voice. "And her build? Slight was she, small of stature?" Galan nodded eagerly. "As I said, sir, for a moment we could have taken her for a boy. She must have used her maid's identity because she thought it was safer if she remained incognito." Now he understood those slight hesitations in Evelyn's speech, and why she had a broader grasp of politics and strategy than most servants would have expected to have. Slowly, Halt and Sir David began to realize the import of what was being said. The king looked from Galan to Halt to David, then back to Galan again. "My daughter is alive," he said quietly. There was a long silence. It was finally broken by Sir David. "Galan, how far behind you were the two apprentices and the girl?" Galan hesitated. "Possibly 2 days' ride, father," he estimated, following his father to the map table and indicating the farthest point that he thought Will and the others might have reached by now. Sir David took to instant charge, sending messengers running to rouse the commander of the cavalry wing and have him prepare a company of light cavalry to leave camp immediately. "We'll send a company of the 5th Lancers to bring them in, sir," he told the king. If they leave within the hour and ride through the night, they should make contact sometime around noon tomorrow." "I'll guide them," Galan offered immediately, and his father nodded assent. "I'd hoped you'd say that." He seized the king's arm, smiling with genuine pleasure at the relief on the tall man's face. "I can't tell you how pleased I am for you, sir," he said. The king looked at him, a little bemused. So recently he had been privately mourning the loss of his beloved daughter, Cassandra. Now, miraculously, she had been restored to life. "My daughter is safe," he said, almost to himself. Back to the bridge. Evelyn crouched over the pile of wood beside the bridge railing. From time to time, she heard the dull thrum of Will's bow as he fired at the approaching enemy, but she forced herself not to look up, concentrating on the job in hand. She knew they had only one chance to get the fire going properly. If she got it wrong this time, it would mean disaster for the kingdom. So she carefully stacked and placed the wood, making sure there was sufficient airspace between the pieces to allow a good draft. She had none of the shavings left to use for tinder this time, but only a few meters away she had a perfect source of fire. The right-hand cable was still blazing fiercely. Satisfied that the wood was stacked properly, she took Will's sax knife and cut several 1-meter lengths of tarred rope from the bridge railing. Thinner lengths, not the massive cable itself. It would have been almost impossible to hack through that in time. Taking the rope lengths, she came to her feet and darted across the bridge to the blazing fire on the other side. It was a simple matter to get the lengths of tarred rope burning. Then she ran back to her first pile and draped the burning rope around the base, trailing it through the gaps she had left in the wood. The flames licked at her fingers as she pushed the rope in between pieces of wood. She bit her lip, ignoring the pain as she made sure the fire was burning freely. The tar-red flames crackled at the wood, flickered, then took. She fanned them for a few seconds as they became established until the lighter kindling strips were burning fiercely. Then the heavier planks began to take fire as well. The handrail caught in several places, and new tongues of flame were shooting up to the cable, beginning to lick at it, feeding on the tar, then running up to where it joined the wooden pylon structure. Only now did she take the time to glance up at Will. Her eyes were dazzled by the fire, and she could see him only as a dull blur 5 meters away behind a rock outcrop. As she looked, he rose to a standing position and fired an arrow. She looked into the surrounding darkness but could see no sign of their attackers. The bridge gave another convulsive jerk beneath her feet, and the roadway tilted to an alarming degree as the second of the 3 strands of the right-hand cable burned through, and the structure sagged farther to that side. They wouldn't have much time to get back across to where Horace and Tug waited. She had to warn Will. Sax knife in hand, she ran full pelt to where he crouched behind the rocks, his eyes searching the darkness for movements. He glanced quickly at her as she arrived. "The other side's burning," she said. "Let's get out of here." Grimly, he shook his head, then pointed with his chin to a jumble of rocks barely 30 meters from where they crouched. "Can't risk it," he told her. One of them has got behind those rocks. If we go now, he might have time to save the bridge." Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a quick darting movement to her left and pointed quickly. "There's one," she said, and Will nodded. "I see him," he replied evenly. "He's trying to draw my fire. As soon as I shoot at him, the one closer to us will have a chance. I have to wait for him to show himself before I can shoot." She looked at him, horrified, as she realized the significance of what he was saying. "But that means the others can close in on us," she said. This time, Will said nothing. The incipient panic he had felt was now replaced by a calm sense of resolution. Deep in his heart, a part of him was glad that he hadn't failed. Glad that he hadn't failed Halt, and glad that he had repaid the faith that the older ranger had placed in him when he chose him as an apprentice. He glanced at Evelyn for a long moment, and she realized he was willing to be captured if it kept the enemy away from the bridge just a few minutes longer. "Captured or killed," she amended. Behind them, there was a groaning crash, and she turned to see the first cable finally give way in a shower of flame and sparks. It took the burned-through upper half of its pylon with it. That was the result they had wanted. They had discussed the idea of simply cutting the main cables, but that would have left the major structure of the bridge untouched. The pylons themselves had to be destroyed. Now the entire bridge was hanging, suspended by the left-hand cable, and flames were already eating their way through that. In a few more minutes, she knew the bridge would be gone. The fissure would be impassable once more. Will tried to give her a reassuring smile. It wasn't a very successful attempt, though. "You can't do much more here," he told her. "Get across the bridge while you still have got time." She hesitated, desperately wanting to go, but unwilling to leave him on his own. He was only a boy, she realized, but he was willing to sacrifice himself for her and the rest of the kingdom. "Go," he said, turning to her and shoving at her. And now she thought she could see the glitter of tears in his eyes. Her own eyes filled, and she couldn't see him clearly. She blinked to clear her vision, just in time to see a jagged rock curving down out of the firelight night. "Will!" she shouted, but she was too late. The rock took him in the side of the head, and he grunted in surprise. Then his eyes rolled up, and he fell at her feet, dark blood already welling from his scalp. She heard a rush of feet from several directions, and she tossed the sax knife aside and scrabbled in the dirt for Will's bow. Then she found it and was trying to nock an arrow when rough hands grabbed her, knocking the bow from her grasp and pinning her arms to her sides. The Scandians held her in a bear hug, her face pressed into the rough sheepskin of his vest, smelling of grease and smoke and sweat and all but suffocating her. She kicked out, lashing with her feet and tossing her head, trying to butt the man who was holding her, but to no avail. Beside her, Will lay unmoving in the dust. She began to sob in frustration and anger and sadness, and she heard the Scandians laughing. Then another sound came, and they stopped. The arms holding her released a little, and she was able to see. It was a long, drawn-out, creaking groan, and it came from the bridge. The right-hand support was gone, and the left-hand side, already weakened by the fire, was now holding the entire structure. It was never meant for such a load, even in perfect condition. With a final sharp snap, the pylon shattered at its halfway point, and cables and all, the bridge collapsed slowly in the depths of the fissure, trailing a bright shower of sparks behind it in the darkness. Galan watched impatiently as the company of cavalrymen remounted after a 15-minute break. He was itching to be away, but he knew that both the horses and men needed rest if they were to continue at the killing pace he had set for them. They had been traveling for half a day, and he had estimated they should meet Will's party sometime in the early afternoon. Checking that all the troopers were mounted, he turned to the captain beside him. "All right, Captain," he said, "let's get moving." The captain had actually drawn breath to bellow his command when there was a call from the lead troop. "Horseman coming!" An expectant buzz ran through the cavalrymen. Most of them had no idea what their mission was about. They had been roused out of bed in the early dawn and told to mount and ride. Galan stood in the stirrups, shading his eyes against the midday glare, and he peered in the direction of the trooper had indicated. They hadn't reached the Celtic border yet, and here the terrain was open grasslands with occasional thickets of trees. To the south, Galan's eyes could make out a small cloud of dust, with a galloping figure at the head of it. "Whoever he is, he's in a hurry," the captain observed. Then the forward scout called more information. "3 horsemen," came the shout, but already Galan could see that the report wasn't quite correct. There were 3 horses, but only 1 rider. He experienced a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. "Should we send out an intercept party, sir?" the captain asked him. In times like these, it wasn't always wise to let a stranger ride full pelt into the middle of a group. But now that the rider was closer, Galan could recognize him. More to the point, he could recognize the horse he was riding. Small, shaggy barrel-chested. It was Will's horse, Tug, but it wasn't Will riding him. The lead troop had already fanned out to stop the rider's progress. Galan said quietly to the captain, "Tell them to let him through." The captain repeated the order with considerably more volume, and the troopers separated, leaving a path for Horace. He saw the small group of officers around the company banner, and he headed for them, bringing the shaggy little ranger horse to a halt in front of them. The other horses, which Galan now recognized as Horace's and the pack pony that Evelyn had ridden, were following Tug on a lead rope. "They've got Will!" the boy shouted hoarsely, recognizing Galan among the group of officers. "They got Will and Evelyn!" Galan closed his eyes briefly, feeling a lance of pain in his heart. Then, knowing the answer before he asked, he said, "Wargals?" "Scandians," he replied. "They took them at the bridge. They—" Galan flinched in surprise at the word. Surprise and horror. Bridge? He said urgently. What bridge? Horace was breathing heavily from his exertions. He had alternated between the three horses, switching from one to the other, but not resting himself at any stage. He paused now to get his breath, realizing he should start from the beginning. Across the fissure, he said. That's why Morgorath took the Celts. They were building a huge bridge for him to bring his army across. They had almost gotten it finished when we got there. The captain beside Galan had turned pale. You mean there's a bridge across the fissure? He asked. The implications of such a fact were horrendous. Not anymore, Horace replied, his breathing steadier and his voice a little more under control. Will burned it, Will and Evelyn. But they stayed on the other side to keep the Scandians back and... Scandians? Said Galan. What the devil are Scandians doing on the plateau? Horace made an impatient gesture at the interruption. They were the advance party for a force that's coming up the southern cliffs. The Scandians were going to join forces with the Wargals, cross the bridge, and attack the army in the rear. The group of cavalry officers exchanged looks. Professional soldiers, all of them, could imagine how disastrous that could have been for the royal forces. As well the bridge is gone then, said a lieutenant. Horace swung his tormented gaze on the officer, a young man barely a few years older than himself. But they got Will, he cried, his eyes welling with tears as he thought of how he had stood by and watched helplessly as his friend was knocked out and then carried away. And the girl, added Galan, but Horace dismissed her. Yes, of course they got her, he said, and I'm sorry she's been caught, but Will was my friend. You're sorry she's been caught? Do you know who? The captain interrupted indignantly, for he was one of the few who knew the true nature of their task. But Galan stopped him before he could say more. That's enough, Captain, he said crisply. The officer looked at him angrily, and Galan leaned forward, speaking so that only he could hear. The fewer people who know the girl's name now, the better, he said, and understanding dawned in the officer's eyes. If Morgorath knew that his men held the king's daughter hostage, he would have a powerful tool to bargain with. Galan looked back to Horace. Horace, is there any way they might be able to repair this bridge? He asked, and the muscular youth shook his head vehemently. He was devastated at the loss of his friend, but his pride in Will's accomplishment was obvious as he described it. No way at all, he replied. It's gone, well and truly. Will made sure that nothing remained on the far side. That's why he's caught. He wanted to make sure. He paused and added, they might get a small rope bridge across, of course. That decided Galan. He turned to the captain. Captain, you'll continue with the company and make sure no bridge of any kind is thrown across the fissure. We don't want any of Morgorath's forces, no matter how small, coming across. Get Horace to show you the location on a map. Hold the south side of the fissure until you're relieved, and keep patrols moving either side to locate any other possible crossing points. There won't be any of those, he added. Horace, you'll come with me and report to the king, now. He stopped abruptly as he realized that Horace was waiting for a chance to say something. He nodded for the apprentice to go ahead. The Scandians, said Horace. They're not just on the plateau. They're sending a force north of the Thorntree Forest as well. There was another buzz of comment from the officers as they realized how close their army had come to disaster. 2 unexpected forces attacking from the rear would have left the king's men very hard-pressed indeed. You're sure of this? Galan asked, and Horace nodded several times. Well, Will overheard them talking about it, he said. Their forces on the beach and in the fens are a feint. The real attack was always going to come from behind. Then we don't have a moment to waste, said Galan. That force in the northwest could still be a big problem if the king doesn't know about it. He turned to the company commander. Captain, you have your orders. Get your men to the fissure as soon as you can. The captain saluted briefly and issued a few crisp orders to his officers. They galloped off to their troops, and after a quick conference while Horace pointed out the site of the fallen bridge on a map of the area, the entire company was on the move, heading at a brisk canter for the fissure. Galan turned to Horace. Let's go, he said simply. Wearily, the young warrior nodded, then turned back to mount his own horse. Tug hesitated, pawing the ground as he watched the cavalry ride away, back toward where he had last seen his master. He trotted a few uncertain paces after the troop, then, at a word from Galan, he reluctantly fell in behind the tall ranger. Ho, 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 I think think I'm going to stop for there because, ooh, it's a good place to stop because we're going to go back to Will. So, all right. See you later. Have a good day.